won't take it personally. It's good for you as well.
We're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and welcome to those of you here in the ZSR auditorium, and welcome to those of you live streaming. I'm Tanya Zanish-Belcher, Director of Special Collections and Archives here at ZSR Library, and we are pleased to host our first in-person event in 2 years. I would especially like to thank ZSR IT genius, Barry Davis, over there in the corner, for all his technology assistance this afternoon. Yes, yes. Our speaker today will be Mary Tribble, who will be speaking about her ancestor, Sarah Sally Waite, in her talk, From Her Hand, Sally Merriam Waite's Mission South. Mary Tribble joined Wake Forest University in 2014 as Senior Advisor for Engagement Strategies in Alumni Engagement. Tribble graduated from Wake Forest in 1982 with a degree in art history and completed her Master of Arts in Liberal Studies in 2019. A seventh-generation Wake Forester, Tribble wrote her thesis on the untold story of her great-great-great-great-grandmother, Sally Waite, wife of Wake Forest first president Samuel Waite. She also oversees the Wake Forest Historical Museum at the site of the original campus in Wake Forest, North Carolina, and is a member of the steering committee for the Slavery, Race, and Memory Project, an initiative to re-examine the university's history with regards to slavery and its legacies. Mary recently published Pious Ambitions, Sally Merriam Waite's Mission South, 1813 to 1831, based in large part on the manuscripts we hold in special collections on the 6th floor here in ZSR. Today's presentation is an important reminder of how the documentary record can connect us to the past while also informing who we are today as Wake Foresters and as Americans. It's easy, and I hear this a lot, to dismiss archives as simply representing something old with little relevance for today. However, the decisions made by the Waite family, made nearly 200 years ago, still impact Wake Forest University every day. By collecting and preserving collections, experiences, and stories from the past through today, and by making them accessible to researchers, students, and scholars, we can better understand and make meaning of our modern world. And I'm going to turn this over to Mary.
Thank you, Tanya. I'm so happy to be here, and it's exciting for me to be here today for two reasons. One is that I always love talking about Sally Waite, but secondly, so much of my research did happen here in the library. So some of you have sat through iterations of Sally's story before, and thank you for coming back. But today's going to be a little bit different because I really want to talk about the research process and really talk about kind of the magic and the mysteries and sometimes little miracles that occur within the archives. So I'm going to start this story with a nurse, a stamp dealer, and a barrel in a basement. In 1993, a stamp dealer showed up at Z. Smith Reynolds Library with a sheath full of letters, 19th century letters, and also included were diaries and journals and receipts and so on. He was representing a nurse who had been the caretaker to the last daughter, the youngest daughter of the youngest grandson of Sally and Samuel Waite. Her father was Charles Edward Charles Edward Brewer, and he had been president of Meredith College. He had 4 children, but only 2 who lived into adulthood, Ellen and Annalisa. Annalisa was named after her grandmother. And both the sisters eventually passed on with no children. And so Annalisa Brewer, when she died in 1993, left all of the belongings in her house to this caretaker. And down in the basement, the nurse found a 55-gallon drum barrel. It probably didn't look like this, but it's how I like to imagine it. And she found this barrel and inside all these letters, and she showed up at a stamp show in Raleigh, North Carolina, and met a stamp dealer from Locust, North Carolina, who read enough of the letters to realize what she had and knew that they belonged here at the library. So he came to the library, sold them to the library for $3,000, and this to me is the best. I've always said it's a miracle that any of these papers still survive. We could have lost these papers at any stretch along that story. So the fact that they were here, to me, is pretty miraculous. So when those items were donated in 1993, I think there was an article in Wake Forest magazine, and my mother read that article. This is my mom, Bird. She's also in the audience, and she plays a role in all of this. So that's why I wanted to introduce you to her. So Mom was interested in the Waits story because, as you heard, we are direct descendants from the Waits, and she's also a historian in her own right. So she began coming up here in the summers, and this is back when they let you Xerox 19th century letters at the library, and so she would Xerox them, take them back down to Miami, and painstakingly transcribe all these letters. And her intention at the time was to publish a book of the Waits letters to each other. But life got in the way, and she, along the way, she started asking me to maybe pick up where she left off, and I obstinately said no. I was busy running a business in Charlotte, and I just wasn't interested in all that. And it wasn't until I actually came back to Wake Forest when I started to work for the alumni engagement area that kind of just the weight and the significance of the Waits story began to call to me. And I started to do a little bit of research on her, and I thought, you know what? I think maybe it's time to bring a woman's voice to the narrative, to the Wake Forest historical narrative. So I began doing the research, and what I decided I wanted to learn was why this young woman, Sally Merriam, who lived in a lovely little town called Brandon, Vermont, had a lovely existence. Her father was a merchant farmer. They weren't well-to-do, but they enjoyed a certain amount of recognition in town because her uncle was very well-to-do. He was a town entrepreneur, town elder. So she was living a lovely life. And why did she then end up during the early Republic, traveling around in a covered wagon, raising money for the Baptists in the back roads of North Carolina? I mean, why? This does not sound like fun to me, and I'm not sure why she did it. And that she eventually ended up at an abandoned plant or sold plantation in Wake Forest, North Carolina, and you all know the rest from there. So that was what I was setting out to do and to look for. So I want to talk today a little bit about the sources and how the sources at the library allowed me to also then connect the dots with all these other both primary sources, secondary sources, and field trips and all the like. This is actually my notebook. I'm at the Brandon Inn in Brandon, Vermont. Jake Rudderman can tell you he got lots of emails from me that trip. I'm going to tell you more about that. So let's talk about the sources. Well, first of all roads lead to and from the Special Collection at Z. Smith Reynolds. And if you've never spent any time in that room, I encourage you to do so. Every time I write about it or talk about it, I can still smell it. There's something about these smooth wooden tables and these old bookcases full of gems that is just so compelling to me. So I'll talk a little bit about the collection and describe it for you. So the collection, it's extensive. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters and other documents. It's informative. It tells us something about every character in this story, but at the same time, it's incomplete. There are letters that are missing. There are other items that are missing that I'll tell you about in a few minutes as we go through. And sometimes the collection is silent. It doesn't speak necessarily to every topic that I wanted it to speak to. It doesn't tell me everything that's there. And to some degree, it's all meaningless without context. And I'll give you one example of that. When I first started reading Sally's journal, which plays a big part in her story, I read it and I kept thinking, oh my gosh, this woman is a little manic depressive. I'm a little concerned about her, because on one page she would just be reeling in her faith and awe and devotion, and the next page she would be down on her knees in a feast of tears. And I couldn't understand what was causing this kind of recursive experience until I studied history of the Baptists with Bill Leonard and started reading other evangelical women's writing at the time, and this is how they talked. This is what they said. They literally took, I can take Sally's journal and put it up against several other books written by women of her time, and the terminology and the phraseology is exactly the same. You can just lift it from place to place. So without the context, the archives really, they need to be informed. So let's talk about the actual content. So letters. So I told you my mother spent months and months transcribing letters. This is a good example of one. Sometimes they were cross-hatched, which means they wrote across it, then they turned it, and they wrote across the other way. So you had to figure out what was going here and what was going here. This happens, and so you have to learn handwriting. Everybody has different handwriting, and I can tell you that I know Sally's handwriting, because I know when she ends a word that ends with D, it gives this big swoop back at the end when she ends that D. So I know it's hers. This is actually Sally's mother's letter, and she's writing about, it's in 1831, she's actually writing to Sally about the Nat Turner insurrection, because she's up in Vermont. Sally and Samuel have just made the decision to move to North Carolina, and her mother is concerned about what is going on in the South. So lots and lots of letters. Sally's journal is a big piece, I said earlier, that plays a major role in this work, and I'm going to tell you a lot more about it in a moment, but remember I told you there are some things that are missing from the archives? Do you see the title page says Sally Merriam's Journal Continued? There's a missing journal. There's a missing journal. We don't know. Where's the other barrel? Yes. There is rumor about that there was a missing barrel. So, and I will tell you, I talked to the stamp dealer in Locust, North Carolina 2 weeks ago. He does not remember that there's a missing barrel. So the mystery continues. But at any rate, so we don't know. She could, for all we know, she destroyed it herself. Maybe the first journal was about her courtship with someone else. I don't know. But there are missing pieces all the way. We'll talk more about the journal in a minute. Then other sources that I studied were, first of all, things like, I can't tell you how many evenings, 9 and 10 o'clock at night, I was reading online 19th century Baptist texts, right? And if somebody told me I would be doing that in the evenings a few years ago, I'd tell you you were crazy. So fortunate that there's so much that's digitized that I was able to actually, so I could read along with what was going on in the Vermont Baptist Association through their minutes and be able to match it up to what was going on in Sally's journal and other things that were happening. This also, to the right, are the church records from Brandon Baptist Church, and I'll tell you that story in a minute, too. We also have items that have been passed down to the family that still remain in private hands. Tanya, I'm going to tell you today it is time to start the Accession Papers, because this is coming to you all now. I promised you a long time ago that when we had this event, it was time to pass some of these things along. This is what some people would refer to as a commonplace book. It actually overlaps Sally's journal in time, not completely. It started earlier, and a commonplace book would be where the writer would kind of work out their own. She's kind of working out some of her theological opinions and thoughts. They also might copy down poems or other pieces of writing. And so what appears in this commonplace book is another window into what's going on in Sally's life at this particular time. Especially a couple of the end poems are about women who were married to ministers. And around the time she started copying those poems was when she was courting Samuel Waite and kind of trying on that for size. This is an essay that she writes on greatness. So to kind of sum up all the sources, we've got the barrel, we've got all kinds of trips. The red barn-looking building is where they lived when they lived in New Bern. Jake Ruddiman is there because, first of all, Jake Ruddiman is my thesis advisor, so thank you, Jake. Yes, and he's there to represent the fact that I figured out pretty early on that I needed to further my education before I could really do Sally justice. So at the time, Tony Parent was running the Liberal Studies, Masters of Liberal Studies program, and he and I sat down and I decided to pursue my Master's in Liberal Studies and had a whole lot of fabulous professors along the way that taught me about things like the early Republic and history of the Baptists, because you needed to understand that. I also had guides along the way. This woman is Faith Clausens. she's the one in the blue top. We are cooling our feet in a Vermont stream. So I decided I needed to go to Brandon Baptist Church because we needed to find out if there were any records there that could shed more light. So you should know that like 25 plus years ago, my mother went to Brandon as she was doing her research, and she and my dad got there. They stayed at the Brandon Inn, the same place that I stayed, and unfortunately, the first night they were there, they learned that her mother, my grandmother, had passed away. So they had to throw everything in the car and go south again, so grab get on a plane and so on. So she had planned to visit the church the next day, and so never got to. So when I did my trip, I kind of recreated mom's plans, and I decided I went ahead and ahead of time I contacted the minister of the Baptist church, who was the same minister my mom had gone there like 25 plus years before, told him I was coming, and I decided the best time to come would be 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. So I wheeled in and went to church, and the first person I met was Faith, and because of course her name is Faith. And had Mom gone to Brandon Baptist Church 20-some years ago, somebody would have taken her up to the attic and showed her just a room full of just piles and piles and piles of unorganized papers. Because it wasn't until Faith Clausens joined this church that she's the only church member who cared about these archives. And she had gone up in intervening years, she had gone up and actually organized everything. And so by the time I got there, everything was in perfect order in terms of date and so on, including the Brandon Baptist Church records. And this is the book. It starts in 1796. It goes for decades and decades. This is the record book for the church, much of it written in Sally's uncle's hand because he was the secretary of the church for many, many years. And I've read other church records from other churches. This one tops them all. Usually they will just, and Bill, I know you've probably been in some before, but usually it will just say, it'll say who's leaving, like who's been baptized and who's leaving the church and who's coming to the church and maybe who preaches. This book has every single scandal that happened at the Brandon Baptist Church for decades and decades. And I'm telling you, it's Elder Starkweather and Mrs. Hall. It's everything. It's everything. So I got all kinds of really great insight. And again, it's just one more piece of, deep information that helps me understand who Sally is. But probably the biggest piece is Sally's journal. And this is a story, again, about the importance of the archives and the objects themselves. So you can see that this is her journal. This is the outside of it, then the inside, as you saw, the title page. And there's a poem at the bottom of the page, and it says, "Soon fades the flower, soon fleets the zephyr's breath. In the midst of life, we tread the verge of death." All right, so not the most upbeat way to theme a 19-year-old woman writing, doing her diary, not very upbeat. For the longest time, I just assumed that it was 4 lines from a hymn, because inside her journal, she quotes Isaac Watts hymns all the time. But finally, I just decided to do some digging, and then with the help of the Google machine, I found indeed it was 4 lines from a poem written by a man named William Lee Pierce called The Year. William Lee Pierce was only a few years older than Sally. He lived not too far from Sally. And this is a poem in 3 cantos that is a very long and tedious recitation of everything that happened in the year 1812. Everything. And a lot of bad things happened in the year of 1812. For one, there was a war, if you recall. Also, there was a terrible earthquake that started in Venezuela and was felt all the way up to the Ohio Valley, and people died. There was a terrible fire in Richmond at a theater house where even the governor died. I mean, hundreds of people were jumping out the window and lost their lives. And then, of course, there were epidemics. There were typhoid. There were epidemics that were going on. So that gives me, just those 4 lines gives me, what does that tell me about what's in Sally's mind, right? That she would theme her whole journal to that. But most importantly, so as I said, Mom transcribed all these archives, and for I'd say the first year and a half, I read Sally's journal through Mom's transcription. And so I read it, it was typewritten, 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper. And I read it that way over and over and over again. And finally, I don't know what spurred me, but one day I came in, or I emailed ahead of time, probably Rebecca, and I said, Rebecca, I'd like to see the journal. And they pulled it out, and when I saw it, so it's just about this big, but when I saw it and kind of held it in my hands and saw that first page, so this first page actually introduces us to Samuel Waite for the first time. Does not name him by name, and in fact, she goes through the whole journal, even after they're engaged. The most she ever refers to him is Mr. W with a line afterwards. So, but she introduces us to Samuel here, that by figuring out the rest, you can see that. And then this is the last page up here where you can see she's written in tiny, she's really trying to finish the end of her story at the end of that page. And then when I kind of opened it up in the middle, it was somewhere in the middle that she agreed to marry Samuel Waite. So all of a sudden, I'm like, oh my gosh, this has a story arc. Miracle guy has another microphone. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. So I realize it has a story arc. She has constructed this story, and she's constructed this diary both literally and figuratively, because Tanya actually took it to a conservator who could tell us that, I mean, she copied, I'm sure she had notes, and she copied it down in a neat hand. This was not a journal or a diary that she kept under her mattress, pulled out and wrote in it, and put it back under her mattress, and the next day pulled it out. It was constructed. She wrote it on these pieces of paper that had been sewn together, most likely with her own hand, and then she had put on this cover. The conservator feels like it was probably wallpaper remnants that made the cover. And all of a sudden I realized, all right, this is a performative piece. This is not something that Sally was just writing for herself. She was writing for an imagined reader. And it wasn't uncommon for women of that time to write journals and share them with their friends. I believe she actually penned this she constructed it between the time she agreed to marry Samuel and the time they got married. And I tend to think that she wrote it for her someday daughter to read, and then her someday daughter's daughter, and daughter's daughter's daughter, and daughter's daughter's daughter, and daughter's daughter's daughter. She couldn't have planned it as well as she did. But what it really became is, I think it's a good example of a piece of kind of self-made conduct literature. So conduct literature at that time could either be fiction or nonfiction, and it was usually some kind of piece of literature that told young people how they needed to live their life. In this case, it's the story of an evangelical courtship. So that's a piece of information that I don't know that I ever would have figured out if I had not come and seen the object itself. And that is something that you can't recreate in other ways. So, spoiler alert, they did get married. And so this becomes, and this is probably the precipitating event that leads her to North Carolina. But other than her marriage to Samuel, there are really kind of four precipitating events that put her on the path to North Carolina. I'm going to concentrate mostly on the first one because it's to me, it's a really good, fun unraveling of how you use archives along with other sources to figure things out. And then I'll talk a little bit about the last one, and I'll just touch on 2 and 3. So the first precipitating event is Sally's spiritual birthday. In her journal on April 3rd, she writes, "Full well, my spiritual birthday, full well how I recollect how cheerless and sad appeared the morn, April 3rd, 1813. And then she goes on to say, "Full well also I remember how bright and resplendent shone the sun at 3 in the afternoon." So first of all, I was going over this talk with Lynn, my sister, yesterday, who happens to be in town, and she looked at her watch. She said, "Today's April 3rd. So we toasted Sally's spiritual birthday at dinner last night with wine, which she may not have appreciated, but we did nonetheless. But so what's the context for this? I mean, why April 3rd? Why did it happen at all, first of all? But what's the context for her conversion to have happened on that day? Well, the broader context is the Second Great Awakening, which is a time during the early Republic where these camp meetings and revivals were happening all up and down the East Coast, and there was a sense of, I already told you that from the pulpit, because being able to find the minutes from the Baptist Association's meetings, they were writing that God's judgments are abroad in this earth. The shaking tempest has now begun. God has taken his fan in his hand and will thoroughly purge his civil and ecclesiastical floor. End times were coming. End times were coming. That's what William Lee Pierce's book is all about, reciting all these horrible things that happened in 1812. Surely that is proof that end times are near. So there's a sense of urgency for these young people to be converted. Layer on top of that, the Brandon Baptist Church records. I look in April 1813, and it notes that there appears an uncommon solemnity on the minds of the youth. Some few are hopefully converted. So conversion was kind of a coming of age during this time. Sally grew up in the Baptist Church, but still there becomes this time when you have your conversion, you put the frivolities of your youth behind you, and you decide that you're going to lead a pious life. So something's going on in town, because it's not just Sally, there's some other people that are being converted as well. Well, back in the archives, there was one folder that just had some loose sheets of paper in it. And it was really a folder that had poems in it. And the poems didn't date, they weren't from the same date. There was one that was more related to, I think, Annalisa, her daughter's wedding. But there's this loose poem, and it says, "A poem written by William A. Finney on the occasion of the death of Abigail Farrington." He writes it on April 4th. That's the day after Sally's spiritual birthday. All right, that's interesting. So in the poem, he writes that while 6 fond mates did kindly drop a tear and marched in woe to grave the funeral bier, ye sound mourners on that gloomy day with mournful offices trod the solemn way. So who were those 6 fond mates? Was Sally one of them? Well, Jake Ruddiman taught me how to research old newspapers. So I go to the Rutland Herald, and on April 7th, there's a death notice for a young girl named Nabby Farrington. Nabby is a diminutive for Abigail. And she has died. It notes that she died on the 31st. She's the daughter of a highly ranked officer who's fighting in the War of 1812. So she kind of carries some cred. And it says that she's died, and she died within 4 days. I find out there's a typhoid epidemic going on. The thing that's noticeable, and they talk about the glorious proof of the immorality of the soul, the uncertainty of life, the satisfaction. She was cut off in the prime of her youth, in the midst of her youthfulness and pride, and her connection to family and friends. She was clearly a highly admired young girl, because there are maybe at least a dozen other death notices in that day's paper, and even the adults only get 1 line. Nabby's got a whole paragraph. So she's clearly an important figure, an important young person in this and in this story and in this town. So what I was able to do by connecting all those dots is to figure out it was Nabby's funeral. Sally goes to Nabby's funeral in the morning, loaded with sin and despair, and comes out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon with the sun shining bright. And that becomes her moment of conversion that I was able to kind of put together by connecting all these different dots. And then I was able to confirm it back with the Brandon Baptist Church records, because about 5 weeks later, Sally Merriam gets baptized, probably in the Neshobe River. But it's not her baptism day that she celebrates every year. It is her spiritual birthday on April 3rd. I will say, so my second trip to Brandon, I brought Mom back because, of course, and we actually got to attend a baptism of one of the members of Brandon Baptist Church. This is not the Neshobe River; it's a family lake, but it just somehow was this perfect full circle of coming together and actually witnessing a baptism. So her conversion is what led to everything. She decided she wanted to lead a life. She wanted to be a missionary. She wanted to follow in the footsteps of a Baptist missionary to Burma named Ann Hasseltine Judson. And that's really what becomes precipitating event number 2, which basically was the rise of this Black Baptist missions and the idea that the Baptists came together nationally to want to raise money for global missions. So that's the precipitating event we don't have time to go into. The third one is we also won't go into detail, but this is an important one because it's how they get from, how they start considering North Carolina. So Samuel has gone to study at Columbia University, which is now George Washington University. Sally's still up in Vermont raising money, making bonnets so that he can study and buy books. And the college is about to go under, so they have to go on a fundraising trip south, and the president of the college, William Stoughton, asked Samuel Waite to come along. So they're in New Bern, North Carolina, raising money for Columbian College, and the horse bucks and the carriage crashes, and Dr. Stoughton is injured. This is the Wake Forest origin story, if you haven't heard it before. And Dr. Stoughton is injured, and so they kind of have an extra week or two in New Bern. And at that time, New Bern was a pretty hopping little place. It was called the Vortex of Fashion. It was just a really, really fabulous place to be, apparently. And the Baptist church, they had a church, but they had no minister. And so they begin cultivating Samuel, and they want him to come. And they're showering him with gifts, and they're promising him a huge salary. And so Samuel begins then recruiting Sally. And Sally kind of doesn't want to come south. Then there's 2 big reasons. One is that she happens to know for a fact that the South is hot and Northerners will die. And she actually has proof of that because it happened to a cousin, kind of. And so the whole climate thing was a big deal. But there was also the subject of slavery. And so this is another area where the archives are not complete to my satisfaction. So this is Sally has a very strongly anti-slavery family in Vermont. And so when they begin considering moving south, this is her sister-in-law, Asha, in her later years. She writes, our strong and prevailing objection to the South is slavery, slavery. And Isaac, her older brother, says, I can't believe you endure slavery before your eyes. Her mother writes many, many letters admonishing them not to move south. And Sally herself kind of cryptically writes a few people up north that, this is not, we don't really want to raise our children in this manner, but she never tells us outright. And trust me, I looked. I wanted to find a document where Sally denounced slavery desperately. And in fact, not only did I not, but by 1838, I think it was, when Wake Forest decided to divide up some of the land for lots and people started building inns or boarding houses, the Waites decided to run a boarding house. And in fact, this is the front page of the deed of when they actually did buy purchase 2 women. So the further and further south they got, they would have been exposed to it in D.C. Because that was, of course, the basis of all the domestic slave trade. And Surely they would have seen the slave prisons in D.C. when they went into town. They could have easily have seen shackles and coffles of slaves, enslaved people. And then when they get to New Bern, there are 2 enslaved people in their home. They were clearly leased at that point. And then, as you see, the deeper and deeper they get into the South, the more entrenched, unfortunately, they also become into the system of slavery and become participants in it. So that's an area where I really would have liked to have found something that would tell me more about how she really felt. But so the final precipitating event is what I want to end with, and rather than describe it to you, I'm actually just going to read a little bit so that you can see kind of what it was, what the final straw was that had Sally say, yes, okay, I'm going to come south. So the frequent separation and infrequent communication were wearing on the little family. By this time, Sally and Samuel had lived together only about 7 years of their 13-year marriage. Sally was concerned about his distance from them, telling Sally to, quote, "Kiss the dear children for me 1,000 times. I pray to God that no evil may befall them or you." Sally missed Samuel tremendously. For all her missionary dreams and his wanderings, she wrote that all she really wanted was for God to preserve your life and your health amidst all your wanderings and bring us back together again around our own fireside and our own family altar. She worried that her children were growing up without a father. They missed their pa. Shortly after Sally arrived back in Brandon, she wrote about her son, William Carey, and his older sister, Annalisa. William Carey begins to say a few words. Ask him where his papa is, and he'll reply, "Gone." Annalisa says, "Tell Pa I want to see him and to kiss him. Tell him he must come here in the stage, and I will give him some of Grandma's very sweet apples." Sally continued about Annalisa, "She very often dreams about you and wakes me to tell me her dream." During Sally and Samuel's earliest partings, while she may have pined for her husband, she had the comfort that their separation was guided by their shared duty to God. Understanding that concept as an adult Baptist was one thing, explaining it to 2 tiny children was another. Despite the couple's concerns, Samuel writes that he never felt better satisfied that he was in the path of duty. At the same time, he did wonder what it might be like to give up the pull of duty and take an easier path. He was still vacillating about their long-term investment in North Carolina. His current 1-year engagement with the North Carolina Baptist Convention would expire in spring 1831, and he wondered if New England or North Carolina would trumpet their final call. Samuel's thoughts often went to Sally and their, quote, "dear babes." He worried that Annalisa would forget him and reminded Sally to tell her to mind her ma, learn to read pretty well before I come, and pray every day. And with William Carey so young, he knew he couldn't understand a word I write. How I want to see the little fellow with his cap on, making tracks in the snow. Samuel Waite wrote these words on January 11th, 1831, from Anson County, North Carolina. What Samuel did not know when he wrote this letter, what he could not have known, was that William Carey, his 1.5-year-old son, was dead. 4 months would pass before Samuel would read the detail of his son's death. His January letter, filled with ruminations about the couple's future, wended its way to a grieving mother, while Sally's letter, fastened with black sealing wax to indicate the mournful news, tried to catch up with Samuel as he moved from town to town. In May, back in Brandon, Sally penned the painful particulars. As she had planned, Sally traveled with her family a few days before Christmas to Tinmouth, Vermont, where Sally's family, father and brothers lived. On December 29th, William Carey had been at play, although he seemed to be coming down with what Sally wrote called a hard cold. Sally sent for a doctor when his symptoms grew worse and his fever developed. Still, she was not particularly alarmed. The attending physician gave the child an emetic, possibly the commonly used tartrate, to cause vomiting, which she writes operated favorably and greatly relieved him. However, the following night, she writes, his respiration became very much oppressed, and towards the morning, his voice entirely failed him. The family again sent for the doctor while they desperately tried to relieve his lungs, she writes, to no effect. His respiration became more labored, and while, quote, the little creature was sensible of his sufferings to the last. Sally described the heartbreaking scene at the end when her son raised himself in the cradle and desired to be taken into my arms. Sally took William Carey into her lap, holding him and rocking the struggling child. Within minutes, she writes, his breath suddenly stopped. He gasped twice and expired. Powerless to save her dying baby, Sally, quote, watched the return of another sigh. His lungs had ceased to heave, and his spirit had fled from its clay tenement forever, unquote. Sally William Carey died in her arms at 11:30. So while that tragedy was going on, Samuel was actually at the North Carolina Baptist, the second annual meeting of the North Carolina Baptist Convention, and I think in Raleigh, or right outside of Raleigh. And that letter with the black sealing wax, and by the way, it's another missing piece in the archives. That grief, that letter, that mourning letter, doesn't exist, at least not here. And it's possible it got passed. It's possible it was too painful to keep. It's also possible it got passed down through another family member. But Samuel was at the North Carolina Convention. He walked out of that, the opening session, and was handed this letter. He immediately knew it was mournful news, but he thought it was going to be his mother or his father or perhaps a sibling. And then fell, of course, into grief. Ironically, at that same meeting, his contract was renewed for another year to spend yet another year on the back roads of North Carolina. And so he writes to her when he gets the news, and he says, just come. Just come. You and Aunt Eliza, come. We'll travel as much as we can together, and we'll get you as far to Raleigh or so where we can stay with friends until we get set up and live a life together. And sure enough, about 2 or 3 weeks after that exchange, Sally made the arduous trek down south by herself with her little 4-year-old daughter, Aunt Eliza, and ended up eventually on a plantation called Wake. And that's the story. So we've got some time for questions, I think, if anyone has any. While you're
Mary, I was really struck by the fact that on Sally's spiritual birthday, the sun came out at 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
So, as Good Friday approaches, that's when the darkness lifted.
Ah, yes.
The parallel is just striking.
Yep. Well, and perhaps intentional, right? I mean, she took certain artistic license, right? So she may have not been. I mean, that may not have been a coincidence, or it may have been. It clearly stayed with her and struck her for all her life. Any other questions? Yes. Hi, Molly.
So, what sort of a relationship have you developed with Sally? How do you feel about her after being in such an intimate, long-time study of her as a person?
That's a great question. For those watching at home, Molly asked a fabulous question, which is, what kind of relationship do I have with Sally after spending so much time with her and studying her? Frankly, I see myself in her in some ways. I see, it's funny. I titled the book Pious Ambitions because clearly there are two very strong lines that come up for me about Sally, and it is her piety, but it is also her ambition. And she not only demonstrates her ambition in terms of wanting to become a missionary and to write journals that get shared and that sort of thing. But she starts making bonnets while Samuel's down in school in D.C. She teaches herself how to make leghorn bonnets, and leghorn bonnets are the kind you see in the Jane Austen movies. And she starts selling them for like a lot of money. I mean, $100 or so, which is a lot of money back then. And she even goes to the extent that at one point she writes a letter to Samuel and says, why don't you stop at the White House and see if the First Lady would like a bonnet. So, she knew about marketing placement, right? And so she's just, I think we often think of historical people, historical women, maybe in one-dimensional terms. And she's complex. I was able to kind of watch, so I think some of my marketing savvy maybe came from her. Mom shared with me last year, a couple years ago, she had she came across a handwritten note that her mother, my Nana, wrote about Sally. She must have been making notes to address a Sunday school class about Sally or something, I'm not sure. But she starts making the notes, and she writes that Sally's ambitious. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because I had already picked that word of her without having known her. And of course, Nana would have had, more kind of oral history passed down to her. And so the thought that ambitious kind of came up as well, I thought was interesting. So I like her a lot. I just think she's got a lot of life and a lot of tenacity, and she's a fully dimensional woman to me. She's not perfect. Clearly, in many ways, she's not perfect. Participating in the world of slavery is not something that I had hoped for her. When I started this work, I had kind of naively thought, oh, well, they're poor Baptist ministers. Surely they don't have enslaved people. And then one day I was in the Special Collections room, and Andrew Kennedy, who was kind of collaborating, we were kind of both doing our independent work, because Andrew's working on a new history of Wake Forest. And that's when he showed me that bill of sale, that all of a sudden it informed me about who I am. So this work has helped me understand all the complexities of my lineage, my family, and also the circumstances, that we're still dealing with, right here today, right? We just hosted last week the University Studied Slavery Conference, where we had university representatives from all over the country that are grappling with and dealing with these issues. And one thing that's common is that it's not uncommon. And that's hard to deal with, but it's essential that we do. So,
Thank you.
yes, yeah.
I was struck by her desire to go to Burma, and how that never realized how she was able to send some students there.
That's right.
But I wonder, in the undercurrent, if she ever came to terms with that's what she really wanted to do and never was able to do that. Did you, in your book, it kind of shows like it was always there.
Yeah, that's such a great question, and it's something I've grappled with. So for folks that are looking at streaming, so Sally and Samuel are seriously trying to decide where their mission is going to be, where their calling is. And at one point, it gets down to Burma or North Carolina, both equally as exotic. And you've got to remember, the Northern Baptists considered the South a mission field. And so her heroine, Anne Hasseltine Judson, who was the first Baptist missionary to Burma, was her idol. And Anne Judson would write back these missives that would be published in religious tracts, and she would read them breathlessly. She writes about them in her journal. She and Samuel write about Anne Judson on and off throughout their lives. And so, in the end, and everybody's trying to talk her out of going to Burma. Her mother writes her a letter and says, surely the Baptists have a better way to spend their money, because your health is not that great. And if you go to Burma, you're going to die. And that's all that money wasted. And so indeed, in the end, they do decide not to. And really, it's as much as anything, it's the calling of North Carolina and Samuel that's pulling her that way. But I do, at the end of the book, I write, so there's this item that we still have in the family. It's called a Chinese wedding basket. And it's a little woven basket that has, again, lovingly been handed down generation after generation. And it was given to Sally by the wife of, so Wake Forest, I can't remember what year it is. It's maybe 1840 or so, that they, Yates, I can't remember Yates's first name, but anyway, Yates is Matthew T. Yates. It's good to have Andrew in the audience. Matthew Yates graduates from Wake Forest, and he decides to become a missionary, and they send him to China. So it's like, that is a big deal that this little tiny manual labor institute is able to send a missionary to China. And so he marries, and they go off together. And when they come back, Sally gets as a gift this Chinese wedding basket, which is, again, so coveted and so special to them. And I do kind of posit at the end, like, does that wedding basket, whenever she sees it, is she, like, proud that oh, I started this college and somebody got to be a missionary? Or does her heart sink a little bit thinking, oh, maybe I should have, I never did that. And, so I don't know. I think she was very satisfied and well situated at Wake Forest. She kind of becomes kind of a mother figure to the early students. I mean, she very much participates in things that happen on campus. And her daughter, Annalisa, who was their only living daughter, has 10 children. So the grandchildren grow up around her, and she's known for educating them and, having them at her knee and so on. So I do wonder what she would think about Wake Forest now. I mean, I just, I can't imagine what she would think. Probably, maybe, not really good things. I don't know, because it's no longer this institution that is, dedicated to sending off Baptist ministers to study. But I hope she'd be a little proud. So, yeah, Bill.
So, how would you describe Sally as the woman behind the great man, and to what extent did they found Wake Forest together?
That's a great question. I think to the extent that any 19th century woman would have that role. She definitely, being an early 19th century woman, she finds herself, having to operate within the women's sphere, which is, men get the public sphere, women get what they can contribute to, and it usually is house. And also around this time in the early Republic, women are starting to get social agency with, raising funds for the poor, raising funds. There's all kinds of women's funds to raise money. So women are starting to get social agency at that point. She calls herself a helpmeet. And that's how she envisions herself. But, nothing really, I mean, she would, if Samuel insisted that they go to North Carolina and she said no, they would have still probably gone to North Carolina, right? I mean, because there was only so much, I mean, she goes where the husband goes. But as with any relationship, I mean, you can see through their letters to each other that she has a good deal of influence on him. I mean, think about it. I mean, how often do you tell your spouse absolutely no versus, cajoling or, withholding affection, whatever. So, there are ways that she had influence within the sphere that she could operate. So I would say that she had very little recognition during that time. Now, she would, while he was raising money, she would be getting linens donated and other things that women could provide. So I see her as an equal partner. I don't think she was, given any more due at that time than any other woman of her time would have. That's what I'm guessing. And by the way, I don't know if I've said it out loud at this lecture, but Samuel married up. So I just want to make that clear. Sally's family was much more educated than his, at least by judging by the letters from the families back and forth. There is not a single letter from either of either of Samuel's parents. So I'm not sure how comfortable they were with the pen. I'm not saying they were illiterate, but I'm just saying they didn't write letters. And Samuel was from out in the boonies. He was from Tinmouth, which was rural. It still is rural. It's gorgeous, but there's barely a crossroads. Whereas Sally was from a pretty happening little town. So I think one of the reasons why she took a long time trying to decide was, I think she was considering there was a class distinction, and I think she was considering that. On the other hand, he was kind of hot, so so there was that. So
she polished it.
I would say she probably polished it. Well, yes, although one of the things that riles me up the most is this one letter when Samuel's in D.C. and she's in Vermont, and he is trying to coach her on her pronunciation. And in doing so, you can kind of get an idea of exactly what her accent was. And he writes, that you should say, he describes how to pronounce have, H-A-V-E, have, versus have. And other things like that. It was all about, kind of a New England accent, but, and that really gets my blood boiling because, and he would also while he was doing his studies in D.C., and again, I think she was. Oh, this is a good story. So, as I said, she was writing. She in her commonplace. She was working out kind of her theological ideas and such. And there's a point when Samuel goes to study at Columbian along with her two older brothers, Isaac and Jonathan. And so at one point, Jonathan writes to Sally's mother and says, "Hey, Mom, remember that essay that Sally wrote on the divinity of Christ? Could you kind of like copy it in the form of a letter, but not add her name to it and send it to me?" So I don't know if there was a paper due, but it just shows you how, I mean, that they thought how much they respected her intellect. And I would also say, so I mentioned at the end of at the end of her journal, she's working through this church scandal that's happened. She was put in charge of the committee to investigate this scandal, and it was the affair between Elder Starkweather and Mrs. Hall. And so she's like 20 years old at this point, and she's in charge of this committee and this investigation, and she has to end up confronting. And the way it works in the Baptist church at that point, maybe still, I don't know, is that if you get confronted with a digression, such as Elder Starkweather and Mrs. Hall, you have to confront them, and they have to repent sufficiently that you believe them and that they're sincere. And if their confession is not sincere enough, they tell them to go back and try again, right? So so they'll be forgiven eventually. And indeed, but okay, the sad ending of that is Elder Starkweather just gets sent on his way. He just goes to another church and probably does the same thing. Sound familiar? And Mrs. Hall just she dies. I mean, she just dies like in the course of maybe 6 months because of this public scandal. Oh, but it did turn out during the research that, or during her investigation, that it wasn't just Elder Starkweather. There was the former Reverend Joshua Young as well. So it was a pattern for Mrs. Hall, but the fact is, I mean, she suffered this very. And then they had to get up in front of the church and confess as well. I mean, it's this very public humiliation, and she just died. I mean, so anyway, that's how church. But if you really want to stay up with some really good reading, read the Brandon Baptist Church records. There's all kinds of stuff. I mean, there's one minister. I think it was, I don't know. One minister's also being suspected of having an affair with some lady who runs a place in a nearby town, and Sally's brother is in charge of that one, and the town is like 30 miles away, and Sally sees the minister, and he says something really random about going to Clarendon, and so Sally's brother gets on a horse and chases him all the way to Clarendon to find out that he, yes, indeed, went to the woman's house. So it wasn't just like passively investigating. I mean, so they took their investigations pretty seriously. I don't know if I answered that question. I don't even remember what the question was. That was a rabbit hole. Well done. Well done. Any other questions? Okay. Well, with that, thank you for coming, and I would love to invite you across the way. Rogan Kirsch, who unfortunately can't be here because he's awaiting the outcome of a PCR test, is hosting a little reception across the way at the Green Room. So there's going to be wine, and if you happen to want to read more about Sally Waite, there are copies of my books available, or I'll sign the ones you already have. So thank you all very much for coming.